Me one moment here, and we will make sure everything is working okay. And we're going to do a wake up with me. I haven't done one of these in a while. I've been very focused on play. And typically when that happens, I don't like to get too public with my study. There we go. Looks like it's all working well. I tend to just study on my own, and for the sole purpose that I like to focus, and that playing these cash games, I am playing against players who are watching the stream, and there are some adjustments that I don't want them to see, but we're still going to study the stuff on stream that is from Jonathan Little's courses. So let's go ahead and put this out here. Let me move the chat in case y'all want to ask me something. There is no delay on this stream, so feel free to just fire away. Doesn't have to be poker related. I'm just kind of chilling. So we're going to have fun. I'm going to go ahead and make sure the desktop audio is on. Looks good. And hopefully we can finish up these last 4 sections. In all honesty, it's a lot. This is the end of the flop strategy section. That's taken us a long time to get through. We're going to move on to turn strategy after that. After this, we will be through the bulk of the course. It's super dense, and I'm getting a text now. Hang on one second. Courtney's just out running errands, so had to let her know. So we're going to get through this. Hopefully we can get through this flop stuff. It's been a lot from up to here, so if you haven't seen it, look for the Wake Up With Me streams, and the ones with the different thumbnails denote the different sections. So I changed them, each section that goes through. You can go all the way back. I think we're about 45-ish episodes into the tournament strategy guides. They're only about an hour, or the tournament masterclass on Jonathan Little's training site. They're only about an hour and a half to 2 hours a piece, so it is a lot of stuff, and I'm just studying it right along with you guys. I've been through this once before, but going through it again I think is important. And after this, we're on to the cash game courses, but let's stick with this for now. So this section that we're going to jump into is short stack adjustments as the pre-flop raiser out of position when facing a bet. So we're out of position, we check, somebody bets after we raise pre-flop. And let me make sure that the sound is right. Okay.
Now let's discuss as the pre-flop raiser out of position when facing a bet. So how does this happen? This is when you raise pre-flop, someone in position calls you, and then you check the flop and they bet. Okay, so remember, as a pre-flop raiser, you announced you had a strong hand, and then you're going to check the flop some frequency of the time, usually with some slow plays, mostly marginal made hands, and then some total junk. Because
wait a minute. This isn't right. This is not correct. Hang on. Tournament Masterclass, Flop Strategy. Short stack adjustments as the pre-flop aggressor. Short stack adjustments as the pre-flop caller when checked to. Okay, so we went through the examples. Oh no, this is right. Okay. I thought we were just going to get more examples, but we're going on to a new section. Sorry.
Now let's discuss as the pre-flop raiser out of position when facing a bet. So how does this happen? This is when you raise pre-flop, someone in position calls you, and then you check the flop and they bet. Okay, so remember, as a pre-flop raiser, you announced you had a strong hand, and then you're going to check the flop some frequency of the time, usually with some slow plays, mostly marginal made hands, and then some total junk, because you lack the range advantage, right?
So here's the thing, and I've been talking about this quite a bit. That concept of you're going to check here a certain amount of the time with this, and this example. I think it's important for people to realize that you want to have that kind of thinking all throughout poker. So anytime you do anything, you can figure out why you're doing it, and you can give strength to your actions, right? Like, no matter what the thing is. So there will be times when you will be check raising the river as a bluff. And if you want to say, well, how does that happen? Well, it's only because everything has to be possible in the game to keep it as complex and as dynamic as possible. It's just a small thought, but I just wanted to throw it in there that literally you can justify your actions later by watching your actions now. So like in a situation where you have the nuts, you would be check raising the river. But let's say a simple example, the river makes the nut flush possible and you have only the ace of that suit, right? You can, after leading, let's say it was King 4-9 and there's 2 hearts and you have the King of Spades and the Ace of Hearts in your hand, right? You 3-bet pre-flop, the flop came down, you bet and got raised, the turn comes off, you check, the player bets, you call again, the river comes off making this heart, there's no paired board, you check, the player bets again. If you then jam, you are turning your ace king into a bluff because you're holding the ace of hearts in your hand. You have now made the nut flush possible. You're the one who knows that the nut flush is not possible because you have the ace of hearts. That's a good example of a time when check raising the river as a bluff would be a good move. You're most likely getting somebody to dump everything except the very tip top of their range, and the tip top of their range is not going to include a river flush. In this instance, it's going to include sets. So you can actually push people off there with, a pair of 9s that flopped a set. Believe it or not, it works. I've done it. I've done it live. I've done it online. I've had people show me. It's just one of those things. So you can say, is there ever an instance where I'm going to check raise bluff this situation, or I'm going to check raise for value on the turn and then check back river? You can think about these thoughts ahead of time and then fill in the blanks that will allow you to go, oh, that is an option in these instances because it makes sense here. Just a small thought that I think needs to be said, and I haven't been able to articulate it well while I'm playing, but that's what I wanted to say there about that.
From out of position, you need to be doing some checking, as we've seen. And when you are facing the bet, you need to use the bet response flowchart, where you usually raise your best hands and draws, call your marginal made hands, fold your junk. However, when we get shallower and shallower, we're going to be check raising a little bit more often than when deeper stacked. Because when we're shallower stacked, for the most part, we just don't care if we get it all in with our decent top pairs. And you will have some top pairs when you check here. Because you don't really mind protection, and if you happen to be against a better hand, such as life. That is something I want to point out, right? Whenever we are playing 20 big blinds deep, the idea of conserving our turn...
This is the short stack section, so we are talking about 20 big blinds and less. 25 to 20 big blinds and less, so take all that with a grain of salt about the stuff that's being said here. Good bit of philosophy coming here.
Life, I'm not going to say goes out the window, but it isn't that big of a deal because you're probably going to lose anyway. You're not trying to sit there and blind out and make only the nuts. If you happen to get top pair or a good draw or something like that playing shallow stack, you're just putting your money in. So anyway,
this is that concept of take your shot to get back in the tournament. The only time this is different is if you're near the money bubble or a significant pay jump, or all the other stacks are also short, like you're near the final table. Those are the exceptions. But for the most part, 25 and less big blinds, you're just going to try to get your money in to get back in the tournament, because at 20 to 25 big blinds, you're kind of screwed. You're kind of at the mercy of the deck. But if you take a little extra gamble in smart situations, you can, get double up and now have 45 to 50 big blinds, and you could actually put yourself in a place to win the tournament, from the middle ranges of the time you've gone through. So good, important thing to remember, as Umberto Brenes used to say, in order to live, we must be willing to die.
You're going to want to be check raising with mostly premium hands and some weak draws to balance out the times when you do have the nut advantage. On boards where you check frequently, it turns out you're also going to check raise frequently, because when you are checking frequently from out of position, you're basically checking everything or close to everything, right? So if you're checking close to everything, that means you're going to have a lot of nut hands in your check raising range, or your checking range, that you would like to put into your check raising range, which allows you to check raise with some draws. Also, your check raise size may not necessarily be all in, and usually it will not be all in, and that's because when you're check raising, it's going to be with super nut hands. They don't really care if they get called. And it's going to be with some junky hands that want to check raise with the intention of folding to a jam. When you're check raising here, we're going to find across the board, you're either check raising really good draws or really bad draws. The medium strength draws that are getting the right price to call, don't want to mess that up by raising and then having to fold to a jam because they're not quite getting the right price. So let's go through.
And the other factor that he didn't mention here that I think is huge is that if you have 20 blinds, pre-flop, you raise, somebody calls, you have 18 blinds left. There's 2, 4, 6.5 in the pot, right? Because of the blinds and antes if they didn't come along. So about 5.5 or 6. You check, and then your opponent bets, 2 big blinds, and you raise to 5.5 blinds with only 13 behind. That is a very powerful move. There's nobody who's going to see that and go, oh, this guy's just full of shit 100% of the time. Unless they've truly nutted it, you're going to steal that pot so much. It's kind of ridiculous. It's one of those things that you can really and it happens a lot with, good blocker hands, king, queen, ace, jack, ace, queen suited, things like that. When the board misses both, right? Like you raise and the board comes off, 10 high and you check raise, sometimes you're going to be up against an overpair, but even the overpair sitting there seeing your stack is going to sit there going, holy shit, like how much do you like your jacks on a 9 high board when you're check raised on the flop by the pre-flop aggressor with a short stack? How often are you going to like your fucking pocket jacks now? Like you just might look at that and go, And a lot of times you will see people call and then you just rip the turn and they fucking fold and they're just like, well, shit, I guess the motherfucker had aces. You know what I'm saying? Or whatever it is. You just have to realize the psychological nature of leveraging your whole stack by the size of your raise, because a lot of people don't have the ability to check raise fold and only have, 15 to 12 blinds left, right? People think that it's just the tournament's just over for them at that point. It's not. You know what I'm saying? I mean, honestly, you're really not in the true ultimate danger zone until you're at less than 5 blinds. I've come back from many tournaments at 10 blinds and just won the whole thing. It's the kind of thing you have to understand, though. You are leveraging your stack by your short stack image. Now, you do have to be aware of the player you're doing it against. Some players are just way too new, and they'll just be like, oh, he's check raising me on a 9 high board, and I have jacks. This is awesome. And they're just going to get the money in, and they're, you don't have any bluffs. But, then again, against those same players, you're going to have aces sometimes and just fucking smack them. So you got to really be aware of who you're up against. So this is the example of 20 big blinds, you're under the gun, you raised, versus a button who called your raise. Now you've checked, and the button bets 67%. He bets 2/3 pot on this board. So these are the kind of hands, and you're going to see the response now.
Some common examples. This is where we raise under the gun +1. Button calls. We check the flop. Button now bets the flop.
Now you can see your range is going to be much stronger for this board, right? When you're raising under the gun, you're going to have aces. You're going to have all the aces. You're going to have all the good pairs that made trips. You're going to have all the good draws, things like that. So you're not going to be check raising much. And when you do, it's usually just going to be for the purposes of getting your stack in, like with top pair, ace king, ace queen, things like that. You can call with the other aces, because if you're getting bluffed, you want your opponent to continue bluffing, and you want to determine whether or not they have an ace of their own. If they don't, you want to be able to get away, but you also want to allow them to continue bluffing. There's a lot of instances in this situation where you're going to check call on the flop, check call on the turn, and then the river goes check check, and you roll over ace 8, and they just go fuck, and they lost, and they they muck away whatever they were bluffing with, or value betting something worse than you. So that's really the thing. You can see also like the mega nuts, you're trapping the ace and stuff like that. The ace jack being a check raise or a check jam, it's kind of interesting. You see these hands are less in your frequency because you're going to be open ripping them more, but when they are there, a very small percentage of the time you're going to be check raising the majority and then check jamming a very small portion, because obviously you have the board locked up. But you want to be check raising because you don't want draws to fucking get there for free, and you want somebody with ace queen or ace 10 to just go fucking banana crackers and you take them down.
As you see,
that's how you read these things. You have to remember the perspective. And this is the comparison to when you have 40 big blinds, what you're doing. Much different.
Using very mixed strategies on the flop in general. And when we're facing this check raise, we're just check raising, very polarized, right? Check raising kings, queens, What am I saying? King and queens. Ha! Ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack. I was looking at the kicker. Ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack. Pretty much every time we have it because those are effectively the nuts. Ace 5 is effectively the nuts. And then some sporadic bluffs. But notice we don't actually have a lot of bluffs here. The bluffs, quote unquote bluffs, are actually marginal jacks and the sporadic king 10. So one thing we're also going to see, by the way, whenever we're shallower stacked, is when we're check raising, it's usually going to be very linear with just the hands that are probably best, that are happy getting in. Sometimes they're going to be beat. Like we recognize when we check raise, ace 10 in this scenario, we're probably going to be beat. But that's usually what we are opting to do. So we are going to be substantially more linear.
Don't the suits play roles as well? Yeah, they do. You're seeing here the ace-jack suited. The raise being the majority of the time. That's the 3/4 of the time. Or that's the majority of the time, the 15 out of 16, where we don't have the suit. But when we have the ace-jack the ace-jack suited in like a live suit. Well, I guess there isn't one on this one. But yeah, suits do play a factor. So like the king 10 suited, right, is going to be calling here 45% of the time and folding only 43% of the time. That's when you have backdoors in some combo. There's not a lot of folds there for that. Where's the one where we really see how the suits match? The queen 9 suiteds are the ones that are going to continue here, where you're going to be folding the majority of the time. See this little sliver of green over here? This is the call where you're suited with the queen 9 of spades. So yeah, suits do play a factor to boss. You know what I'm saying? But then again, it's very easy to see. So we're check raising the good draws and stuff like that, like the jack 10 suited. This quarter here, there's only 4 jack 10 suiteds, right? This is about a quarter of the shade here, right? So when we have the jack 10 of spades, that's what this is, we are going to raise it because our equity is so fucking high that even if we're up against ace king, we don't give a shit if we get all the money in. The jack 10 suiteds that we do have that we raised out of early position, because we only have, remember, 4 combos of jack 10 suited, they're calling the majority of the time because we're not sure if our opponent has an ace yet, and we can also hit some backdoor stuff with the straights and things like that, but and 2 pairs. But yeah, this little 1/4 here, this is the suited portion right there. You can see it also in queen jack suited, same amount. You don't have it very often, but when you do, you're going to be check raising this suited portion down here, calling with the unsuited mixed portion, and then folding a very small amount of the time. This is probably an offsuit variety. Maybe this is even the without the queen of spades in your hand, right? So if you had the queen of hearts, jack of diamonds or something on this board, that's probably this combo right here. You can kind of figure it out by looking at the size that's left in here. But yeah, suited varieties obviously make a difference. Like you can see the 9-10 suiteds, the majority of them were folding. This one little sliver over here, this one little thing, that's the one that we're calling with because that's the one suited in spades that's hit the board. You can see the little one combo.
In this scenario where we have fewer bluffs whenever we are check raising in most of these spots. Let's take a look at jack 6-2.
Completely different board, same situation.
Check raising with aces, kings.
Now it's a much smaller bet from the button here on this board, which makes sense because this board is going to hit neither opponent more often. You know what I'm saying? You're both going to be playing on the strength of your hands pre-flop. This is the good one to check raise on. In my opinion, more so than any other. I guess here you go, check raise, 25%, because you're at 20 blinds, you're now below 20 blinds, and this is the jack high flop. This is the one you want. But if you just bet at it, right, unless your opponent has queens, kings, or aces, they're not going to continue. But if you check to them after raising pre-flop, they can bet any jack, they can bet any combination of ace king, ace queen. They can bet 8s, 9s, 10s, 7s, 5s. They can bet all these fucking hands that then those hands cannot withstand a check raise. So it's one of those weird if this then that. If you bet this flop and get action, fucked, right? Unless you actually have the aces and want to get it in. But so c-betting this board as a short stack isn't a great idea. But checking this board and then raising it, and you don't have to go big. Your opponent's going to go like 2, you go like 5.5, maybe 5 even. That is going to look so scary to him, especially when if he calls that, there'll be less than a pot size bet in there for, 1-to-1 stack to pot ratio for you. And it's going to look like you're leveraging your whole stack, and you just like, well, fuck, this guy's got aces. And he's just going to toss it away. You know what I'm saying? Or whatever it is. He's going to think you have a jack or something like that. But tens really can't continue, and that's insanely strong. I'm in this situation a lot, and I use the other side of the logic when I'm the in-position caller, that I don't bet the flop, and that we let the turn come off. Because then if the guy checks twice, okay, he really doesn't have anything. If a safe card has come off, then I can bet, possibly get a call from ace-king or ace-queen. Then when the river comes off, no improvement for either. We go check. I win a much nicer pot, and I don't get blown off the hand, but I do get some value. If you look at it from that perspective, you can see how the response should be. Most players, though, they're just trying to steal, and they think, I can put pressure on this guy. He's only got 18 blinds left. But when that guy with 18 blinds check raises you, you go, fuck. Like, oops. And, like now, you don't feel great about it with pocket tens. You might not feel great about it with pocket queens, which will call in position. You know what I'm saying? Ace-jack? Do you like it here? I mean, if you were going to make this bet on the flop, you kind of want to have tens more than ace-jack, because having the jack on the board, you hit your best possible hand, you've nutted your range, and you're getting raised. Like, what the fuck is going on here? You know what I'm saying? It's a very scary position for players to be in.
Queens, ace-jack, king-jack, queen-jack, right? Those all make logical sense. Ace-6 is check raising to get in. And then we have some interesting bluffs. We have ace-5, ace-4, ace-3. Backdoor draw. Check raising those, presumably to fold to a jam. Ace-king and ace-queen are kind of interesting. If you check raise ace-king and get jammed on, you should probably actually call it off.
Yep.
You don't really like calling it off there, but I think that's probably the play. So pretty dicey.
Because they're usually not going to jam ace-jack. They're going to jam draws, and they're going to jam bad jacks. You know what I'm saying? They're going to jam 10-jack and queen-jack. So when you call, you're going to actually be getting the right price to take your 24% and get the money in with your 6 overs that you can hit that are clean. You know what I'm saying? So when you have ace-king or ace-queen, it's probably a call-off, interestingly, in this scenario, according to the solver.
Spot with ace-king and ace-queen if you do check raise. Interesting to see the solver check raise in these hands, really. And to be fair, I guess it does call them the majority of the time. But cool to see that they do opt to check raise some portion of the time. Some jacks are check raising. If you check raise it, the jack here is the nuts, right? Check raising like king 10 with the idea that you're going to fold it. And then check raising lower pairs every once in a while. Again, it's kind of tough to try to...
I really like check raising the lower pairs. It allows for a lot of steals. I have found that I get a lot of false confidence check raising 9s and 10s on this board. Then the player just calls, and I have a pot-sized bet left. Then I pile it in their face when the turn comes off clean. I've had players show me fucking aces in a live tournament when I did that. Swear to God. And I actually had one guy in a cash game who he had been pissing me off, and I decided to back him off. And I had a very similar situation, and it was a queen high board, and I had jacks, and I realized that based on the size of our stacks after the stack to pot ratio, I was able to play this move because we were just happened to both be kind of short at the moment. And he folded, and he said, if you can show me anything other than aces, I'll give you my stack. And he only had like $40 left. And I said, are you sure? And he's like, yeah. And the dealer said, well, hands over. If you get up, that's it. I turned over the fucking queens. The guy stood up, grabbed the chips, and put them in my hand. And he was like, good play. And it was so scary to him and he had fucking ace queen. He had me dead to rights. But he absolutely was convinced, even by this small betting structure. And it was interesting. The check raise worked really well. So false confidence works just as good as real confidence, because, you'd be surprised how often you're like, oh, I'm not getting called here, and you don't get called there. And then you're just like, well, guess I had the best hand. Not always true, but your method can be strongest.
Replicate the solver here. For the most part, when I'm check raising, when Jonathan Little check raises here, it's going to be with ace-jack, king-jack, aces, kings, queens, low-suited aces. And that's it, right? I think that is perfectly fine.
The low-suited aces as a bluff is because your opponent has less chance of having ace-jack and being very confident. So when they re-raise jam over the top of you, you can be very convinced that they are not going anywhere and that they are not full of shit. But it will force them to fold a bunch, even hands as strong as queen-jack and king-jack sometimes, because they're going to sit there and go, well, fuck, I've hit the best card for my hand. What am I going to do, call and try to hit my other card? this is ridiculous. And they're just going to fold thinking you have ace-jack and just be like, oh, that sucks.
Perfectly viable. It's not going to be perfect GTO. It may even leave your check calling range a little bit weak, but I think that's going to be the right strategy by a mile. So I'm not trying to like check raise 7 some tiny sliver of the time. I want to make that clear again. We're not trying to represent, or we're not trying to replicate the solver. We're trying to just play a very implementable strategy. And right here on this flop, you don't have very many draws. So given you don't have very many draws, you got to find the ones that you would not mind folding to a raise. And that's going to be the low suited aces for the most part.
Sevens might be a bit wide for me. I think 9s and 10s for sure. I don't know about 8s. I might check call 8s. I think 9s is my inflection point. I either check call the 9s or check raise the 9s, and I think I'm folding 8s and lower. I'm not 100% sure though. It's kind of odd. Maybe it's 50-50, where I would call the 8s sometimes and fold them the rest. It's close for me though, but I do like check raising the 10s, and I do like check raising the 9s a good portion of the time when I'm in this scenario. And I haven't had it backfire much because it is so strong. You can't abuse this when you're on that short stack. You got to kind of let time pass between doing it, but I think it's a reasonable thing to have.
Takeaway I'm trying to get you to see here. I want to make it clear, don't try to copy the solver. All right. And this seems all logical and reasonable for the most part, right? 9-7-5. Here we're check raising a pretty good amount of the time now. Check raising sometimes all in even because the board's a little bit more coordinated. I guess we're not actually check raising all in. We're check raising using a 4x size. So that's neat, which is pretty big. And when we do check raise, we're check raising 8s, 6s as draws. Also these low backdoor draws. If you check raise to 4x, by the way, with it ace-3 suited and get jammed on, you're planning to fold. I want to make that clear. Whenever you're check raising, by the way, whenever you're check raising, any hand that is not a great hand, the idea is that you're check raising and then folding to a jam. You're not check raising with the idea of, okay, I'm going to call it off with my ace high. That's not the plan. Okay? So
you have to know that ahead of time and be prepared. And I've had this happen in live scenarios where I've check raised this big amount on a short stack in a tournament and had the guy jam over the top of me. I don't even Hollywood. I just go, whoops, and I just fold the hand very quickly. Go, whoops, that's the end of that. And, and then it gets a big laugh. And then usually from there you get a good amount of respect when you tank. It's a little side benefit, but online this is a move that's far more rare for me. Check raising on the bluff, because it has to be a bigger one on the board like this because you're only representing top pair and over pairs. And when you do that on this board, you're going to want to shut it down right away or get all the fucking money in right away, because there are hands like 10-9 that are betting at you. There are hands like ace-8 that are betting at you that would like to bet but don't want to call it off necessarily with a gut shot and one over and no pair. There's hands like ace-7 that hate it. There's hands like 5-6 and 9-6. Anything containing an 8 or a 6, but not both of them, maybe with a pair like 8-7. All those hands kind of hate it because they know that they have to hit. And yeah, 8-7 has a lot of outs versus pocket aces right here, but if it's for a significant portion of your stack, man, it's going to be very hard, when you have, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 outs. Everybody knows that that's 9, 18, 36%. So when you get check 4x'd, you're like, ugh, you can't call that. So you either have to jam or fold. That's kind of what you're doing, is you're over leveraging your stack, and you are protecting yourself from those times when the guys just flop the monster instead of check jamming. He makes a bet of 2 and you make it fucking 8. You still have 10 blinds left. But if he goes 2 and you just jam, the only thing that's calling you is hands that are just crushing you and you're just fucking dead. When you're bluffing here, even with one pair. Now, your all-ins are much more easy. Your king-9s and your ace-9s are just straight shipping it right on the flop. There's no check raise. There's no nothing. There is a good portion of check raising on those, but you can see these slivers in here where you're just like, top pair, good kicker, and you just get all the money in and kill the pot. And if somebody's got pocket 10s, well, that's going to be too bad for me because they're obviously going to call in this exact betting frame scenario. But occasionally you'll get somebody to fold something when they played, something tricky and they see you being ultra excited about this flop. And just remember, it's your opponent's perception of what you're doing you're really not privy to. You know what I'm saying? You really don't know what's going on in their head. So feel free to construct your own ideas based on their range and then use them ahead of time. That'll allow you to pull these big triggers when you have to. And I don't know how often it happens to me. I'm sure it happens a lot more than I think it does, where I got the best hand to fold. Like, it's kind of rare where you're sitting there and you're going, oh, I got that motherfucker off the best of it. You know what I'm saying? Those are usually the stone bluffs. But in situations like this where you just decide because of your stack and all like that you're just going to play it like it's a monster, you can make people fold a lot more than you think you can.
So that's what we're doing here. Just our good 9s are raising, our 8s that have plenty of equity are raising. Makes logical sense, right? I mean, this is just pretty straightforward, but mostly calling. Also, a little bit less folding here, by the way. You want to be folding a little bit less often, especially when your board connects with the range or with the flop. Okay. Let's take a look at the other spots real quick because I didn't focus on that. Jack 6-2, folding the same amount. Ace Jack 5, folding a little bit more, but roughly the same. Interesting to see we're actually folding way less on this particular board. So that's cool.
Well, because we have the range
Queen 10-5.
advantage.
In this scenario, roughly the same strategy.
Yeah.
Using slightly more raises. This is another spot where, given we're raising very infrequently, I would tell you it's probably fine just to check call everything or most everything.
Yeah.
The hands that do opt to check raise are pretty logical, right? I mean, Queen 10's the nuts, aces is the nuts, queens and 10s are the nuts, some flushes are the nuts. I actually imagine it's probably check raising like ace 3 of diamond.
Saying the nuts here is just like, obviously the suited ace of spades is the nuts, but the conceivable nuts. If you raise and make top 2 pair here and get to check raise, get it all in on this flop, just you're happy. You know what I'm saying? I mean, if somebody flopped a flush on you, well, oop-de-doo, that's too bad. But you're just going to see ace-queen go way too awful or way too crazy with this. Or just the ace of spades. Ace-king with the ace of spades only, they're pretty happy to getting it in. They got 12 outs twice on you. They think they might even have 15 outs twice on you. You know what I'm saying? Because they might think that the king might be good.
Every once in a while, something like that. So, again, if you check raise ace 3 of diamonds here and get re-raised, you fold, right? So, sporadic nonsense bluffs that are solver approved, difficult for humans to implement, but this all makes pretty logical sense. And again, I would probably tell you just to call everything here for simplicity. Jack 6-6.
This is a good one.
Neat spot. So recall this, whenever we were in the big blind, someone raises, we call the big blind, we check the flop, they bet. This is a spot where we're min raising 100% of our range, right? A lot of people think that idea translates to this scenario where we're under the gun +1 and we check the flop, but it does not. Why does it not apply here? Take a second, think about it.
Because the button has more 6s. The button has more 6s and jacks than we do under the gun. Under the gun +1, we're not going to have many 6s and jacks, except for the suited ace-6, and even then you might not play it because you're kind of short, right? It's kind of the worst ace in the deck, the ace-6, and jacks and ace-jack and king-jack. So this board really favors the buttons range over us. We're going to have a lot more misses on this from under the gun, except for just the big pairs, aces, kings, and queens, and jacks, obviously. And we're just never going to lead jacks. So, you know, I mean, you can see it's a call here, check call all day. So that's why, because the buttons range favors this board more.
Well, in this spot, we don't have any nut hands, or we have relatively few nut hands, whereas on Jack 6-6 as the big blind caller, we actually have a lot of nut hands. So this is a spot where we're not going to get to check raise nearly as often. That said, we are check raising some, because here we can check raise aces, kings, ace, jack, basically every time, because if we do check raise these hands and get in on Jack 6-6, yeah, we're going to run into a 6 every once in a while, but it's fine, right? Also notice the draw.
This is also one where when somebody hits a jack, the amount of times you'll see somebody with Jack 10 here on this exact board and you check raise them and then they jam on you and you snap call it with aces and you just see them turn over Jack 10. It's an amazing overplay that players make because they're like, he doesn't have a 6, I have this locked. And that's all that their brain can see. You can take this move and translate it over into deep stack cash games where when you're in the blind or if you have a weird trip on a lower card board like Jack 6-6, like not like Jack 6, but like when the lower board card trips you, especially donking from the small blind, like just donking big into like 4 players, like going 3/4 pot. I'm fucking stunned how many times people just give me the whole 100 big blind stack right there on this spot with King Jack. It's fucking amazing. Like they'll re-raise and I will re-raise and they will re-raise and I will jam all in. And then we started out with a pot that had 8 blinds in it with 5 players in the pot or whatever it was, you know, 15 blinds in it, and we had 97 blinds to get in, and we got it all in on the flop versus a guy with just top pair who's got to hit a 2-outer now. It's fucking staggering. People only think as far as it is convenient and good for them, typically. So they'll only think, this guy doesn't have a 6. I raise. Oh, he's trying to make a move. I re-raise. Oh, he's all in. Pfft, fine. I guess he can't fold whatever garbage he has. Oh, shit, he has aces. Or he has a 6. You know what I'm saying? So understand that's where most people's thinking stops, is he doesn't have a 6. True. A lot of times. But a lot of times I'm going to have aces too, and I'm going to be good.
Calls that check raise are ace high, backdoor draw that don't mind check raising and then folding to a jam, which makes sense, right? King Queen actually check raises some portion of the time too. I'm a little bit surprised to see King Queen check raising here, but
that's a blocker.
It does. 2 overcards, I guess, is good enough to check raise and fold to a jam. Certainly is annoying to check raise and fold to a jam. You're going to find that when the solver is picking its check raises here, a lot of them are usually not annoyed to fold to a jam, but every once in a while you'll find something like King Queen that doesn't necessarily love check raising. Notice the check calling range is still very protected, by the way. Lots of slow plays with stuff like sets. Those don't need to check raise. They just call because they want to keep the opponent in. All right, King 6. Here we have a cool spot. So remember how the low flush draws, the low paired boards out of position, we probably don't want to be doing a lot of check raising, at least not every time. The high boards like Ace XX and King XX, when we...
For the exact opposite reason, we're under the gun. We have all the kings. Our button opponent doesn't have nearly as many kings. We're going to raise Ace King, King Queen, King Jack, King 10 suited. We're going to raise all those. So we're going to have all these. Our opponent's not going to call on the button with Ace King. He's going to 3-bet. He's not going to call with King Queen a lot, especially King Queen suited. He's going to 3-bet. King Jack can get in there, yes. King 10 can get in there, yes. But you're playing against a short stack coming in under the gun, +1. You're not going to take the risk of playing a trouble hand and flopping great and fucking losing. You're just going to muck the King 10 on the button here. You're pretty much looking for a 3-bet or fold scenario with the kings that the button is going to have. Is it going to happen rarely that button's just going to decide to just call with King Queen? Sure. But it's more likely going to be King Jack, and when we're giving him that much heat, it's going to be hard, even though he's got trips. So understand the difference in the dynamic of under the gun +1 versus button's starting range. This is a single raise pot. It was just a raise and a call by the button, and then you checked and the button bet a third of the pot, and then you raised him. What hands do you like here as the button? You like 6s? You like King Queen plus? You can like King Jack, but you don't feel awesome about it. You're probably not going to jam all the money in, right? And then, we can go from there. And, and there's still, backdoor draws that can come through that can fuck you up. So it's going to be kind of rough, but all the kings are in my range. I mean, I even have, King 7 suited and King 8 and King 9 and King 10. All these, suited varieties of king I have. And as the short stack, I'm getting them in. And we're raising more with 25 and less blinds. We're raising those hands more in earlier positions than later because, again, if we hit the flop with top pair, we're probably just fine getting it in. Whereas if we had 40-plus blinds, we don't want to get in, King 8, suited on this board for 40 blinds because we're probably fucking beat. But when you have 20 blinds, you can reasonably get it in here and be just happy as, a pig in shit to get your money in.
We do check. We actually are going to do a decent amount of check raising. Again, we've... normalize these squares such that we don't have 100% of ace 3 here, right? We're actually using, this range. The difference here, though, is that in this scenario, this is a spot where the under the gun +1 player bets very, 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 very frequently, right? So when this player's betting very, 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 very frequently, that means this does not happen all that often. So this is a rare case. When we do check, though, we are going to have some trips in our range. When we check the trips, we get to check raise them. And when we have random cards that wrap around the king, notice we don't really have any cards that wrap around the 6 besides like 9-8, we're going to be raising these too. So this is a cool spot where we're doing a pretty good amount of raising. Not a ton of raising because, again, the player on the button also has a lot of kings, so we can't just raise all the time. But we should be raising our best hands. When we're raising a large chunk of our best hands, a large chunk of our best hands make up a large chunk of our range.
A side note here is that the closer that the button is to your stack size, the more kings he has, typically. Because they're going to be playing all the King Queens, King Jacks, King 10s, suiteds, all things like that. The larger the stack, the less kings they're going to have because they don't want to just take it and double up the short stack. So it seems counterintuitive. You'd think they would play more hands if you have more chips. It's actually not true. You're actually playing more hands if you have less chips, or more combinations of hands if you have less chips, because you need more shots to get back in the tournament. Well, 100 big blinds here, you can just look at King 9 suited and just be like, whatever, and just fucking fold it and just be like, well, that short stack is, I don't want to risk, 20 blinds versus him. Fuck this shit. You know what I'm saying? But on a 25 big blind stack, King 9 suited on the button versus a single razor and no action behind, you kind of want to take that spot. You kind of want to take that flop there, hit a king and see what happens. And then when this board comes out, you're fucking thrilled. But then again, when he check raises, you're going to, shit. You know what I'm saying? So you're getting these weird, funky spots.
In that scenario, we get to check raise with a lot of draws as well, which is why you see like Queen Jack check raising every time. Queen 9, Queen 10, Queen 8, like all those hands just getting after it. All right, one more spot. Here we have under the gun +1 against button on 7-4-3. Under the gun +1 checks, faces a small.
Whenever you see these numbers in here, these are the combination breakdowns of the suited varieties. So because it's a rainbow or it's a 2-heart board and a spade, you do have to break up the backdoor spades into some of these, interpretations. So like having the King 10 suited in spades is very different from having it in hearts. So you can see the breakup of the thing here whenever you see these little numbers. I know you guys can't see them very well. I can't really either. But understand, anytime the solver gets this specific, you're looking to drop the bullshit moves. So we're never going to go all in here. We're going to raise, call, and fold in pretty much equal proportion to all these. It just kind of depends on the opponent you're up against, and it's player specific.
Bet. Again, check raising pretty often now, and that's because this board doesn't really line up great with either player's range. And when this board doesn't line up great with either player's range, that means that whoever had the pre-flop range advantage probably still roughly has it. As you see, it's kind of 50-50 though. But this is a scenario where our strong made hands are actually kind of susceptible to being outdrawn. So whenever you're kind of susceptible to being outdrawn with a very good hand, like aces, kings, queens, jacks, etc., these are hands that really want to raise immediately. Because if you can happily get it in for 20 big blinds, right? You're A-okay getting it in 20 big blinds in this scenario with ace-7 or pocket kings, right? So you get to check raise those. Notice ace-6 and ace-5 opts to check raise. I have to think, if you check raise ace-6 in this scenario, you probably have to fold it to a jam if it's like ace-6 of diamonds. You don't love it, but it's probably the play. So cool spots, but as you see,
the ace-5 of spades,
the solver's doing a decent amount of check raising. Also notice like ace-king and ace-queen sporadically check raise on a lot of boards. Like notice here, jack-6-6, ace-king check raises. 9-7-5, ace-king, ace-queen sporadically check raises. Jack-6.
Because as shitty as ace-king is in this scenario on these flops, it can be the best hand quite often because it is the top 2 highest cards. Nobody's paired, but if nobody's paired and you have ace-king, you have the winner. So you're check raising also as bluff protection. You know what I'm saying? Where if you check raise the flop and it just checks down after that, you're probably going to win with ace-king quite a bit. On a lot of these boards. Sometimes you're going to have to fire again, but I would suggest firing the turn rather than the river. Because if you check raise, fire flop, get called, check turn, or bet turn and get called, and then the river goes check, check, you win a ton because your opponent missed a draw. If he bets, you are going to lose every time. So leading into that is just the dumbest thing ever. But just a side note.
6-2, ace-king, ace-queen sporadically check raises. So those are also hands that you should mix into the check raising range every once in a while, assuming you're trying to be very balanced. But again, if you told me I had to develop an implementable strategy for these spots, I would tell you just to bet very logically polarized. Bet your best hands that are happy getting in, bet your draws that you don't care about folding to a raise, and that's probably going to be very, very acceptable and better than what the vast majority of your opponents do. However, I do want to make it clear, when you do check very frequently out of position, you need to have a check raising range. So many players only check call from out of position. And while I'm sure you can develop a very reasonable check calling strategy where you check call at something like the minimum defense frequency or perhaps a little bit less, it's going to be worse than having a raising range in virtually all scenarios. So spend a little bit of time, go through these charts. These are all the common scenarios you're going to be in, and make sure you understand how to go about developing a flop check raising range. Also, something worth noting, the all-in size is almost never used here. So in any of these scenarios, right? Look, all-in's never used, never used, never used, never used. So as you see, the all-in size is virtually never used in any of these scenarios. And when that's the case, you need to be check raising small. And that means you have to get comfortable check raising small with some hands where you know you're going to get called and you're going to have to go to the turn without a particularly strong hand. I know that's going to feel a little bit icky to some players, but that is what you have to do to be a world-class short-stacked player.
I'm going to very quickly try to put this balm on Choochie. I'm going to keep talking while it goes on. Check raising small like that. Come here, Chooch. Okay. You got a hot spot. I know, buddy. Check raising small like that, and then going on to the turn can seem very, scary and shit. Oh, yeah, you need this, buddy, huh? It can seem very scary, but you have to remember, put yourself in your opponent's shoes. I remember the biggest warm feeling I ever got was one of my first days in Vegas. And I got my job, and then I went over to the Stardust to play poker. And I was like, it was very exciting because I was playing at the world-famous Stardust. It's something I dreamed of my whole life. And after about 20 minutes, I realized I had studied more, I knew more, and I was better than these opponents. And I had the thought in my head, oh, these guys are playing like I did about 3 years ago. They just haven't evolved. They haven't read the books at the time, blah, blah, blah. So I started thinking at that time, and this was my main thought process, and this is before GTO was developed and, all like that. It wasn't so much the if this, then that. It was more so the concept of, if this happened to me when I was at their stage of development, what would I do? And that was able to tell me what to do. So if I had this hand that I suspect them of having, and something like this happened to me, would I feel good about it? Could I fold it? Would I get bluffed? And I just started filling in those blanks, and I murdered the game because I took it from that perspective. And I remember walking away and feeling very connected with people, which I don't, at that time, I really didn't feel very much at all. This is back in 2007. And it made me realize that people are people, and that, people, there's the old saying that people think poker is a card game, and it's not. It's a people game. And it really is true. You have to put yourself in your opponent's shoes and say to yourself, okay, if I was as inexperienced still as they are now, how would I see what I'm doing as? Like, would this mean strength or would this mean weakness? And you can kind of figure out from there what the best plays are. Just a side note. All right, let's do the quiz here. You should check raise frequently on boards that you frequently check due to having more nut hands in your checking range. Yeah. When you have a stronger range for the nut, like that King, King, 6, and you're in early position, check raising that board makes a lot of sense. Should you check raise more as your stack to pot ratio decreases? That's a good question. Probably. Well, wait a minute. If your stack to pot ratio decreases, you're probably going to be check raising less, right? No, you are going to be check raising more as your stacks get shorter. Oh, I get it. Because you're wanting to get the money in more often because you're a shorter stack. I thought about it differently. I'm sorry. You open 20 big blinds deep from under the gun 1 and the button calls. The board comes off 9 of diamonds, 7 of clubs, 5 of spades. You face a check. You check and face a bet of 33%. What should you do with 9-9? Well, I mean, this is a nut hand. I don't think you can actually protect against much. I think you just call here. Yeah, it's a premium. You don't need protection. Your stack to pot ratio is short, so you should just call because it's going to be very easy to get the money in. All right. I'm going to mark that as complete. Let's take a look at the next section. Next section is facing a pre-flop bet. How long is this?
Now let's
video?
discuss
5 minutes?
as the pre-flop raiser in position when you are facing.
All right. So we're the pre-flop raiser in position facing a bet. The most common scenario I can see here is we're in the cutoff for the button. We raise, the big blind or small blind calls, and then they donk lead into us. That, I think, is the most common way we're going to see this. Pretty easy to combat.
Facing a bet. So this means that you were led into, bet into, donked into. And this is a pretty rare occasion. So this is where you raise pre-flop.
Much more common in cash games, by the way.
Big blind calls or small blind calls. Flop comes and they just bet right into you. From the GTO point of view, your opponent should basically never lead. So this really should not happen. Therefore, your opponent's tendencies and their general player type is very, very important. Now you're going to have a pretty good amount of information before acting, and in general, not always, but in general, if someone does develop a leading range, it is usually going to be polarized with their best made hands and some bluffs, either high equity or low equity, or with just the best made hands that they think want protection, right? So if their range is either polarized, which is usually pretty strong, or just decent hands like top pairs or strong middle pairs that don't plan on folding, you really should not do a whole lot of raising because that range is actually pretty strong. So that should lead you to do a lot of calling and very little raising. Unless, of course, you know what your opponent does incorrectly. And typically, when people lead, they're usually doing something incorrectly because they're usually leading with one specific type of hand.
This is why leading out with 2 pair has become a good move for me in the cash games, because people don't see it. They only see that as a check raise at the levels I'm playing at. So they sit there and go, what the fuck is this? I'm going to punish this dude with my aces, because they think I just have 1 pair. And then when the big re-raise jam comes, they go, oh, he must have a draw. And then they call, and they have, the aces get cracked very easily when we have top 2 pair, things like that. It's also good to do with sets sometimes, just the overpowered hands that you would think you shouldn't bet, but it's the counterintuitive thing. Leading out with 1 pair, not the greatest, I don't think. I think that's more of a check raise. But it's interesting how people think in tournaments versus cash. Very similarly in this one specific instance.
All right, so let's go through all the types of ranges your opponent could be leading with and discuss how to respond. We've discussed this previously 40 big blinds deep, so definitely go back and check out that section, but we'll briefly go through this here as well. If your opponent leads with a premium made hand, you're going to want to fold basically everything besides your draws that are getting the right odds to call, as well as your nut hands that beat your opponent's premium made range. If your opponent's just leading the nuts, just fold. There certainly are some players, especially in small 6 games, who are weak and tight, and when they lead, they just have a good hand, they're not folding, so you should just fold everything.
I don't think
life's
I'm weak
easy
and tight.
when your opponent announces they have 2 pair or a set, right? If your opponent leads with marginal made hands that they will not fold, like top pair bad kicker, middle pair good kicker, bottom pair, maybe ace high, depending.
Queen 4-9, you know what I'm saying? And they have Queen 10. A lot of players will lead that to find out. Stupid play.
Depending on the board, etc. In these scenarios, you're going to want to raise your best hands because your opponent's not folding. You just want to get your money in as the favorite. You should call with your marginal made hands that are roughly 50-50 against your opponent's range. And you should also call with your draws that are getting good odds and fold your junk. If your opponent leads with marginal hands that they will fold, now you're going to want to call with your premium made hands to force them to stay in the pot. And you're actually going to want to raise with everything else. Your marginal made hands, your junk, your draws, everything, because your opponent's going to fold. When you have a marginal made hand that lines up 50-50 with your opponent's marginal made hands, you might as well raise and win the pot 100% of the time, right? With your draws, might as well raise and win the pot 100% of the time. And with your junk, you normally have to just lose the pot when you have the junk. But in this scenario, you actually get to raise and steal the pot a ton. Now, I understand we're going to be shallow stacked in this scenario. So when you raise, very often you're going to want to use a relatively small size. Some people will fold their marginal hands to a small raise. Some people will not. I do not think you necessarily need to be just like ripping it all in over a small bet or even a big bet on the flop from your opponent, unless, of course, you know that that is going to result in them folding a large portion of the time. And there are certainly players who will call a small flop raise every time, but will fold to a big flop raise every time. And if you can make your opponent fold out the majority of their range, or all of their range, 100% of the time, clearly, like, that's a spot where you can print a lot of money. So definitely look for this particular spot where you're...
That's a situation you see a lot on final tables where players are leading out because they want to protect their hand. They don't want it to go check, and they think you just have overcards. Maybe they have top pair with a shitty kicker, that queen 9-4 flop with, queen 10 or, something like that. And then they will call a small raise because they do know that they're supposed to not fold yet. In those scenarios on final tables, these are usually where you'll see me say, okay, I'm betting here to set up the turn barrel, and I'm raising small and then leading the turn, and then they go, fuck. You know what I'm saying? And then they just give it up. But if you check raise blast it all in on these players. There's two types of guys. Some of them who would just give up every bad queen, and other ones who will sit there and go, that's bullshit. So you kind of have to know, when you want to get called by certain players and when you want to... The tournament that I took second in about a week and a half ago, I had two players who played very similarly. They just both happened to be on my left, and eventually they were both in the blinds versus me. And on one of them, I check raise, or I bet small and then bet the turn, and then he folded, showed top pair. I didn't show my hand. And then similarly later, I blasted another player after that one had been eliminated. I just blasted over the top of his, probing kind of bet, and he snap called me with top pair no kicker, and my top two pair was crushing, which was kind of hilarious. It was Jack 10 versus Jack 9, and the flop was Jack 10-4. And I don't perceive this player as having wanted to get in 30 blinds with just top pair, but because we made the big bet, he was able to do it. So it's player specific, and you have to understand the kind of opponents you're up against.
Your opponent leads with marginal made hands that they're going to fold, and figure out how they're going to respond if you do raise. If your opponent leads with draws, you want to raise with everything and keep betting on safe turns. You may actually want to just rip it all in on the flop because they have draws by jam.
This you see a lot in WSOP tournaments and cash games where players are leading small to try and control the size of the pot. I always say this, don't let them do that. Raise. I pretty much raise 100% of the time when that happens in cash games, whether I have a value hand or just crap, because they've just told me that they have a draw. Turn comes off safe, and they will call the flop bet. Turn comes off safe, you bet 2/3 pot on the turn, they fold every time.
You effectively price them out.
Interestingly, when you have that one locked up or have the better draw, this one happened a couple times this week, made the same move, but on the turn only bet a little under half pot. They called again. The river came off safe for both. And they checked, and I had the ace high flush draw, and the other player had another flush draw. It was very easy to spot that. So we were able to get value and miss the hand. You know what I'm saying? And making him show that hand was just such a victory moment.
Right? That said, you have to be a little bit careful raising in this scenario with junk because your opponent may have a draw that they just don't fold. So you don't necessarily want to raise the nut low, the worst possible hand, because if they're going to call with their 7 high straight draw or whatever, and you have the 3-2 for the nut low, clearly that's not going to work out well for you. So use a little bit of logic here. Raise with your hands that beat the draws, essentially, if you think your opponent's going to call off with the draws. And if your opponent leads with junk, which some people do, you're going to want to call with your premium hands and strong made hands that are generally not all that susceptible to being outdrawn, and then just raise with everything else to collect the pot. So that's what you want to do when your opponents are leading with very specific strategies. Again, you need to pay attention, you need to figure out what they're doing wrong, and you need to exploit them, because the GTO strategy is to check everything. And when they do lead, it implies they are not playing the GTO strategy. Either they just think they're supposed to lead with some particular type of hand, or they're trying to exploit you because they think you're either going to fold too much, raise too much, call too much, etc. And once you know what they're leading with, because you've played with them, you're paying attention, you're experimenting and seeing what works and what doesn't, once you learn what they're doing, you'll be able to maximally exploit them for a huge amount of money. It turns out, when people deviate from GTO in very consistent ways that you can predict going forward, you can just absolutely crush them as long as they don't adjust and then counter-exploit you.
It's like a player who has a certain, I'm thinking of a few of them now, who have a certain tendency to 3-bet always in certain positions versus raises in other positions. I try to get in that position that they will always 3-bet against, playing cash games, because it just works out so well for me by 4-betting my crap pre-flop and calling with my monsters and then, extracting value. But it's a powerful sentence that's said there is that you're never supposed to lead into the pre-flop raiser unless it's an exploit. That means it is not the optimal strategy. That means it is not game theory optimal. You know what I'm saying? The thing you have to understand about GTO is that it means game theory optimal. It means in the best case scenarios, what moves will break you even versus the field, and leading into the razor is not on the chart. It's just not something that ever seems optimal to do, no matter what your hand is, because you're removing so much information that you're going to possibly get from the pre-flop razor. So when somebody deviates from that, you have to understand they're either playing an exploit on you, but most of the time they just don't play well. They don't understand the concept. In this day and age, playing well is playing GTO. And when players don't have that base, they're very much so behind the times, and you can punish them. Your opponent leads with marginal hands that they will fold. You should raise with your premium hands. False. Keep them in there. You're beating them. Let them keep going. In general, with shorter stacks, should you raise more or less often against a lead? Well, that would be more often because you have a lower stack to pot ratio, and you can pick up more pots. Yeah, that makes plenty of sense to me. Yeah. Mark that as complete. I believe we have 2 more sections to go. I really need to pee, but I want to see how long this section is that we're going into. So I may take a break here in a sec.
Now,
5 minutes. Let's try to get through.
let's discuss as the pre-flop raiser in position when you bet the flop and get check raised.
Okay, so this is the opposite scenario. Somebody raised under the gun. You called it, as the pre-flop raiser in position facing a check raise. So you raised on the button. Somebody calls in the blind. They check. You bet. They raise.
Raised when we are playing somewhat shallow stacked. So recall that at the lower stack to pot ratios, when we're playing shallow stacked, the player who check raises is usually going to be a little bit less polarized, meaning they have a more linear range, right? So their range is just going to be mostly good, strong hands, plus a few bluffs that have good equity. And that's because they don't really want to be check raising hands that really rely on getting a rare turn and river card, like if they have a gut shot straight draw or something. And they also don't want to necessarily be check raising, knowing that they have to fold these hands to a jam. So as stack to pot ratio decreases, you're going to find that when you have a hand that's just pretty good, you should be willing to get it all in immediately, assuming your opponent didn't check raise all in to begin with because you were so shallow. Also, you'll find that there is generally a large increase in 3-betting the flop once we start to get really shallower, especially with hands that we would have normally called a check raise with, like top pair good kicker. When you're playing really deep stacked, you don't really want to get top pair good kicker in immediately on the flop, because when you do get action, quite often you may find yourself in a pretty bad spot where your opponent has a hand like 2 pair or trips or something like that. So this is a spot where you have to be a little bit more cautious. In general, when you are facing this check raise, you're going to want to be 3-betting, re-raising, getting it in on the flop with your premium hands that need protection plus some draws. And you're going to be calling with your premium hands that don't need protection, your strong but like non-nut hands, and then also your draws that don't want to stack off immediately. So let's take a look at a few examples here, comparing the 40 big blind play to 20 big blind play. So let's take a look at the spot where under the gun +1 raises, big blind calls, flop comes jack 6-6, big blind checks, under the gun +1 bets a third pot, big blind raises. 40 big blind deep, as you can see, there is literally no re-raising range on the flop because your opponent has a whole lot of 6s, right? The player in the big blind has a huge nut advantage, and that's going to result in the big blind or the under the gun +1 player just doing a ton of calling, like a lot of calling. However, 20 big blinds deep, you see now that some hands are opting just to get it all in immediately. Queens just wants to get it in against all the jacks, same thing against ace jack. And then king queen is used as a bluff. This is essentially the best draw possible because it has 2 overcards to the jack. So that's a hand that opts to get it in for balance purposes. Notice though, still not really a ton of folding facing this raise, 38%. The under the gun +1 player calls with 6s, calls with a lot of the jacks, and then calls with various overcards and ace high backdoor flush draws. And the plan on the turn is to not fold the jacks, by the way. Like if you do have a jack in this scenario, you're just stacking off on the turn if your opponent jams. And you'll fold out the ace highs if your opponent jams the turn. If your opponent checks the turn, you're usually opting to try to just see a somewhat cheap showdown, assuming your opponent will be protecting their checking range by checking with some of their 6s. But this is a spot where we know that the under the gun +1 player has a severe nut disadvantage, right? So when they have a severe nut disadvantage, they're just trying to see a somewhat cheap showdown to the best of their ability. I know it's difficult when you're playing relatively shallow stacked, but you'd rather lose half your chips than all of your chips. Let's take a look at this spot, ace jack 5. Now, under the gun +1 raises, big blind calls. Flop comes ace jack 5. Big blind checks, under the gun +1 bets small, as they will do with their entire range. Big blind now raises. As we see again, only about 10% re-raising on the flop, playing very deep stacked, just with a lot of the best hands. And 20 big blinds deep, we see a whole lot more re-raising. That's because essentially any reasonable top pair is definitely good enough to get it in at this stack depth. And also notice there are a lot of draws available that the player in the big blind could have that you don't care if they fold, right? If your opponent does have a hand like a flush draw or a gut shot with a backdoor flush draw or something like that, if they do opt to check raise those on the flop, you just rip it all in immediately. Notice that we have all of these spade draws jamming as well. Notice we don't actually have a ton of logical draws, so we're just getting it in there. Notice we are folding a little bit more immediately in this scenario. Notice all of the underpairs that bet the flop opt to fold, whereas when we're playing deeper stacks, some of them opt to call. Not a lot, but some of them. The king jack opts to get it in kind of randomly every once in a while, but mostly calls. Notice king queen does fold to the flop raise. Even kings and queens folds to the flop raise, which may seem a little bit tight, given especially it calls the majority of the time with the especially with a spade if it is playing deeper stacked. But really, we have to ask, like, what is the opponent check raising with? And remember, they should generally be just check raising a little bit more linear. And if they're check raising a little bit more linear with mostly their decent aces, turns out kings is really bad against that. Whereas when they're check raising a little bit deeper stacked, they're going to have more junky draws that hands like pocket kings fare well enough against. So in this scenario, we're just re-raising our best hands and getting it in, plus our draws that have plenty of equity, right? And then we're calling with our marginal made hands and super nut hands like aces and jacks, plus a few more.
Junky draws that are check raising you on this when you're deeper would be examples of things like queen 10 with a spade, like with the queen of spades or something like that on this board, where you have a gut shot, you have backdoor spades and all like that. And the kings aren't going to fold, but you can see, like, you can't make that determination here when you're shallower stacked because players don't play the same versus a shallow stack. So that's why the queens or the kings and queens become auto folds.
Marginal made hands like king jack, queen jack, jack 10 that can stick around on the flop and then probably fold to a turn jam. And on the turn, if you do face a jam, you'll call it off with the ace-x type hands that are good enough.
Interesting. Let's do the quiz. The lower the SPR, the more 3-betting on the flop you should do. True. Yeah. You're trying to get the money in faster. You have less chips, get them all in. You open front of the gun, +1, big blind calls. The flop comes ace of spades, jack of hearts, 5 of spades. You bet 33%, and the big blind raises to 50% pot. What should you do with ace-9? I believe that's a jam. I could look right now, but I think it's a jam. I don't think it's ever a fold. I think it's either a jam or a call because we're trying to keep them in, but I think we're just getting it all in. Yeah. Wants to push its immediate equity with short stacked pot ratios. You're going to run into it sometimes, but also when you're both so short, you're both going to be getting it in. So ace-9, I think, is the minimum. Maybe I'm a little tight there because I was thinking ace-10 was my minimum, but maybe I'm a little tight. But I agree, ace-9 can get it in. I just may not show up with the ace-9, which is kind of a leak in my game. Maybe I'm a little bit tighter on that one. Let's see. 3-bet pots with a short stack.
Now let's briefly discuss playing 3-bet pots with short stacks. Now, very often when you do get 3-bet in a shallow stack scenario, you're just going to be all in pre-flop. So this scenario does not come up all that often, but we'll go through a few spots here. Let's discuss as the pre-flop aggressor in 3-bet pots. So now this is going to be similar to playing 40 big blinds deep, but now there's going to be even more small continuation betting. So remember, as the 3-better, very often you're just going to be betting very frequently using a small size. That applies here as well. Usually a small size is going to be very small, like 2 big blinds into the 12 big blind pot. And that's because generally you're going to have a pretty big range and nut advantage. And these spots play very, very similarly to 40 big blinds deep, so we're not going to go into any examples here, but realize that you essentially should be betting with even fewer draws at this point. That said, your range should be pretty strong, so you're going to find that betting frequently using a tiny size is really just the play. I know that sounds a little bit overly simplistic, but if you do that with a strong range, it's going to work out pretty well. As the caller, again, use the bet response flowchart, right? Realize when we're playing somewhat shallow stacked, your equity realization is going to be better compared to when we were playing deeper stacked, because if you just have like any pair is good enough to get all in. Let's say, for example, let's say you raise from the button with 7-6 suited, the small blind 3 bets. Let's say you make it 2 big blinds, they make it 5 big blinds out of the 20 big blind stack. That's a spot where you probably have to call with that 7-6 suited. If they bet the flop, you're probably going to end up having to play this hand, right? If you make any sort of pair. So this is a spot where you're probably just going to end up having to call and then call it off. It's unfortunate, but whenever you get a decent hand, you just have to put your money in. As the preflop caller in position when check to, this scenario really should not come up all that often because remember, the out of position 3-better, especially the out of position 3-better, should be betting very, very frequently. So when your opponent does check, especially when shallow stacked, you got to think something's up. Usually the opponent's range is going to be mostly marginal made hands that don't plan on folding and also some just super nut hands that are trying to trap you. So in reality, in this spot, you're going to want to be pretty cautious because when something should happen very infrequently, usually it's an indicator of your opponent getting tricky. So just do a ton of checking. If you are going to bet, you want to be using a very small size again. And when you are betting, usually you want to be betting your premium hands that are happy getting in, your draws that are really bad but have a little bit of equity. This is going to be like bad gut shots, right, to balance out your betting range. You don't want to bet your good draws because if you bet your good draws and you're probably going to get jammed all in, it's not really where you want to be, right? You'd rather just check and try to realize your equity for free. Marginal hands, definitely just want to check and see the showdown. And junk, just give up. So this is a spot where you do need to be pretty cautious in this scenario. Again, because it doesn't happen very often. And when it does happen, your opponent's probably getting a little bit tricky.
Makes sense. Let's do the quiz. You should do more small betting in 20 big blinds deep compared to 40 or deep in 3-bet pots. True? Yeah, just more betting. Mark, this is complete. I believe this completes the flop section. I'm not 100% sure. Hey, it did. So this is the short stack strategy of the flop section. We're going to mark this as complete. And it should take us back to the course. Okay. So the next section is where I think I had the most fun in this the first time I went through. Turn continuation betting. I learned a ton on that and really changed my continuation betting, also based on frequencies and board textures. It's very interesting. It's actually a shorter section, but it means a ton. I think most of your big decisions are made on the turn, so it's where you define the hand. But then again, you have to have gone through the pre-flop, the flop, now you're on the turn. So turn barreling here, this gets really fun, and we'll pick that up next time. Hopefully we'll be able to do that tomorrow. I'm trying to make these things standardized 3 days a week of the study sessions, but I'm really obsessed with the 1K to 10K challenge. A little bit of side note. When I get to 10K, I can start taking less money from my dad, and I can start making more withdrawals to pay my own expenses. So it's a big step for me, but I realize I can't rush it. I was just talking to him, and he was saying, I understand that, but don't feel the need to overplay, play at your best, stuff like that. He understands what I'm trying to do. And then getting into the 10K to 100K bankroll plus life expenses is the next goal. But so I do want to standardize these to do 3 days a week. Maybe we'll do something like Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Who knows? Maybe we'll just do it whenever I feel like. But I'm going to try to stay disciplined, and we're going to get through this tournament masterclass hopefully within the next month or so. And yeah. So thanks you guys for coming out. Not anybody here. We're going to re-upload this on YouTube. That's usually where most people catch these. And I will see you later tonight. I'm going to be playing some cash, maybe some tournaments. I haven't decided yet, but we'll see. Have a great day. Thanks for coming out. Appreciate all the interaction.